Hi everybody. You guys able to hear me okay? Okay, great. Then let's go ahead and get started. So, as usual, just a few, I appreciate the multilingual confirmations of audio. We'll start with some logistics. Just a reminder, if you have not completed the mid-semester survey, please do that. Last I checked, there were 18 responses so far to the survey, and that's just really helpful for how we will go forward with the semester. So please take a few minutes to fill that out if you haven't done so already. Next thing, semester projects. I am still working my way through all of your prototypes. They all look very good. For now, continue to refine your prototypes. Continue to add in, functionality, make it look the way that you want it to look. Continue to play around with that. We will have what we call revision 1 will be due a week from today. I'll post some more details about that tomorrow on Canvas, but it's really not much different than what you've done so far. Just what we'll be doing is, rather than just submitting it to me, everyone will submit their prototypes, and then I'll shuffle them around, and everybody will give feedback on somebody else's prototype. So it'll be kind of your first chance to have someone who's not closely involved with designing it give some feedback on it. So that'll be due a week from today, and I'll give you some more information before then. But just in general, keep refining those prototypes. So I read through all of the discussion board for the previous reflection about your experiences with the prototyping tools, and I kind of went through and made a list of the tool they were using, and kind of the good and bad things and the questions that you had. And so what I'm going to do is we'll take a portion of the lectures next week to do some hands-on work with Adobe XD and Figma, since those are the two most popular ones, and there were a lot of questions about different parts of those tools. We'll look at some of the more advanced features, the plug-in stuff, and I'll try to dedicate some lecture time to doing that, and that way you'll be able to ask questions while I have it up on screen, and we can try to work through things and see what the tools are capable of, and if there are things that they can't do, and how we might be able to get around that. So we will use, next week we'll continue talking about evaluation and stats and visualization, but we'll also set aside some time for those prototyping tools, just so we can be sure that they're doing everything that we need them to do. All right, next up, you have a new reflection today. It's about doing studies, about evaluation. It's a paper from, I think it's from an HCI conference. And it's about the different biases people have when you ask them to evaluate something. I think you'll enjoy it. So for the reflection, you'll just read that paper. It's on Canvas. And then there are a couple of questions about the paper. And that'll be due on Monday by midnight, like it usually is. So last time we talked about kind of the first part of designing and conducting user studies, what we decided to call evaluation. And we talked about evaluation being a major part of design in terms of its feedback, and it gives you a signal as a designer, as an engineer, on what's working, what's not working in your system, what might need to change, and how you can improve it. And we talked a little bit about the different ways to go about evaluation, where you can evaluate things, in the lab, in the wild, what kinds of things you might, look at, usability versus user experience. And we discussed kind of the high points of how all of that can be used to refine a product. So today we're going to kind of go into part 2 of that. So we're going to talk about actually designing an evaluation. So how do we design something to evaluate our prototype or our product or our system? So I'll start off with just a couple of terms that I'll use today. So the first one is participant, and that's going to be kind of synonymous with user. So it just means a person that's going to use your system, your prototype, and evaluate it. So when they come in for studies, we usually call them participants. When we talk about them in design, we usually call them users. Same thing. A researcher, we will consider as kind of the person involved in conducting the study or the evaluation or the usability test. In a lot of cases, that person will be the same person who is the designer or has some role in building the system. And I think you'll, when you do the reflection paper, you'll see that one of the things they look at is how does that affect how people evaluate something if they know that that person is someone who built the system. And I mentioned that a little bit talking about some of the studies we do in the lab I work in and how that has an effect. And then the third term that we'll need to know is condition. So condition will just be referring to maybe a different version of the system or the system tuned to behave a little bit differently. So, it could be something as simple as for one user who evaluates it, we're going to make the background color green, and for the other one, we're going to make it red, and we'll see if there's a difference in how they evaluate it. So there's 2 different conditions, a green condition and a red condition in that case. All right. So when we, that text got some drop shadow on it. Okay. So when we start to look at developing our evaluations or our studies, and I'll kind of use those interchangeably too, evaluation or study, and so they're both talking about the same thing. But the first thing we're going to do is we have to think up what questions do we want to answer. Last time we talked about all these different things you can investigate. We need to decide what type of evaluation are we going to conduct. Will it be a simple usability study? Will it be informal? Or will it be a rigorous lab study? Or maybe it'll be out in the field with somebody doing some specific job. Once we've decided that, then we start to get into the really important part of identifying and describing our variables of interest, so the things we want to measure when someone's using the system. And then we have to decide how we're going to measure those. So those are really critical things, and we'll talk about those in detail. Then we also need to identify who's going to participate in evaluating our interface. And I should say these steps, kind of the 2 through 4 here, they kind of all happen at the same time. So if you're going to do an evaluation with like young children or something, that's probably going to affect maybe the type of evaluation or how you measure something. So these don't necessarily strictly happen in this order. This is just kind of in general. But once you've done that, so you've got the questions you want to answer, you've got an idea of how you're going to do that, how you're going to measure it, and who you're going to ask to evaluate your product or your system. Then you need to create a protocol. And if you're doing just a usability test or a quick feedback kind of thing that's not formal, a protocol can be pretty simple. Just a couple of items on a list. Maybe we're going to do this, this, and this. If as you move towards doing a more rigorous study, especially if you're going to do something that you're going to publish the results, or you're in the academic world, or you're developing a standard or something, the protocols need to be more and more rigorous. So you can kind of think of like whenever a new drug is tested, right? There are very rigorous protocols about how you're going to test that and what you would do if this happens or that happens, and it all has to be planned in advance. So that's pretty important. Then the next thing you're going to need to do, depending on, again, how formal this is or what it is you're doing, is you'll need to obtain approvals related to what you're doing. So if you're working in a university, in a research setting, you're going to need to go through institutional review board, where you submit all of these written documents, your protocols and everything that you'll do, and the board will look over that and either approve or ask you more questions about what it is you want to do. And that relates more to the ethical side of things, to safety, to protecting people who are going to participate in studies. Now, when you do this outside of the academic world, if you're at a company, a lot of companies will still consult a private institutional review board, so that they have the necessary oversight, because they also want liability protection and legal protection for these kinds of things, because you're working with people and you're having them evaluate something. Usually the risks are not too high when it's just software or an app, but you can imagine that there are cases, and certainly once you involve hardware, there are a lot of things to think about in terms of that. And then once you've got all of that, you start to conduct the evaluation. So let's kind of talk about these a little bit in more depth. So determining the questions that you want to answer. We spoke about this last time, that you could be looking at a very broad question or a very specific question, and that really just depends on where you are in your design process, and kind of what your needs are in terms of developing the product. So a lot of times you'll start with kind of a broader evaluation, where you just have someone use your system in general. You might ask them to use it to do something like let's say you were building like a map application, right? You might ask them to find a local park or something, and then observe that process or time that process or evaluate it in some way. Or you might have them find that park and save it to your favorites, and then do this or that, kind of taking them through the whole system as you would imagine it. On the other hand, you might be very focused on something very specific, where you want to just see how do they maybe like drop a pin on a map with a touch screen, right? What do people do? What's kind of their intuition there? Is it easier or harder if you design it a certain way? It can be very focused like that. So some examples, so just kind of random, but these are some questions that might come up in hypothetical products. So like the podcast app on a phone, right? It could be as simple as, are users able to find and listen to the podcasts that they're interested in? But you could also look further and see, how do users feel about their overall experience with the podcast app? Does it frustrate them that the sleep timer options are incredibly limited on iOS? Some of them, yes, it does. But that's a broader question, and so you would use different approaches to answer that. Another question might be something as simple as like if you think about Amazon or Google or all these home devices that are voice assistants, right? What kind of errors occur most frequently when people use these devices? And then you might think about, so for example, Amazon has a version of their device that goes in the car. Are the errors that happen in the car the same as the errors that happen in the home? And that's something that's helpful in discovering problems that you may have been building the Amazon Echo for years and putting it in people's homes, and you have a great system. But as soon as you move it to this new environment, you've got other things to think about that you haven't refined so much. So that's one of the questions that could be answered in evaluation. There are other broader questions. So what are privacy concerns that users might have about a smart speaker, right? And that you don't even necessarily have to have the product to have the user try it. You can go out and talk to people and survey people and gauge their attitudes and thoughts about this kind of thing. And that's a type of evaluation. Another one might be something like, how is the user experience impacted if you've got a GPS navigation device in a vehicle and it uses either a male or a female voice to tell you, turn left or do this. And then you might take that further. Does it matter if the user is someone who grew up and lives in Germany versus someone who grew up and lives in the US? That's actually something there's been research done on, because initially when GPSs became popular, a specific gendered voice did not work well in Germany. And it's a cultural effect that wasn't seen in the US, but that's something that evaluation is needed to be able to even find that problem, and to do something to make the user experience better, or maybe try to change people's attitudes. Some other examples that are things that have definitely happened. So like you might say, if you're Netflix, you've got a bunch of different machine learning algorithms that are picking the thumbnail, right, for the movies or TV shows that show up on the screen. And you want to know which algorithm or which approach is producing the most user engagement. That's something that you might be able to do without anyone, without having to recruit anyone or anything. You can just use all of the different users that are already on your platform and show them different things and see how it affects their engagement. On the other hand, you might care more about what is the user experience like if we really customize like search results or something. So you may have heard of a concept of a filter bubble, or basically a kind of this thing that exists in that a lot of systems we use are tailored to us as users. They learn things about us and our habits, or people that are similar to us, and so they kind of only present us things they think we might like or might be convenient to us. That might be a really good user experience. On the other hand, that might not be a great user experience in terms of people don't get to discover new things. So if you over-tailor to someone, that might be an overall bad user experience. Then we get into even bigger questions about, will this product cause harm to society? A lot of research on that. But then maybe you just care about which shade of yellow users like best. These are all in the category of evaluation, is endless possibilities. So once you've found your question, whatever it may be, however big or small, then you've got to think about what mechanism are we going to use to answer the question. So I've broken it down here into two kind of major approaches that we usually see. So the first one is either a usability evaluation, or sometimes just called usability testing. And that's the very basic level of the usability of a system. That's where we look at how people use it. Does it work? Does it not work? How long does it take them to do something? That's where the formative and summative evaluations come in. On the other hand, we also have this other category that's more of a user study. And that's where we want to compare or characterize the difference between two systems, or more likely it's the same system with two different approaches to a feature or a design of a specific element. So in that case, we're manipulating something about our system to see how it affects the user, and we can look at both usability and user experience there. So just to remind you about formative and summative evaluations. So the formative evaluations, usually they take place while you're still doing the design process. They can be more informal, and they're focused on exploring the problem space and solution to it. On the other hand, summative evaluations tend to occur later in development, pretty much once you have a product that's already done. You really want to characterize things about it and in some cases compare it to other standards or kind of build a usability specification based on it. So just good to remember that. So again, we discussed this last time, usability evaluations, or usability evaluations / testing versus user studies, where the evaluations or the testing are less formal, not as experimental, not as controlled. They're not really focused on rigorous statistics or anything like that, but they're meant to be useful to the developer, to the designer, to the people working on the product. On the other hand, we also have the more controlled user studies that are more experimental design and more rigorous. Usually you're going to want to be able to run some statistical analysis on this, and you're going to want to be able to maybe share your results and replicate those results and show that something performs in a specific way. So we have these examples of a usability evaluation being something like, on our night light app, just asking basic questions. Can the user turn the light on and off? Can they choose the color? Whereas the experimental version of that might be something more like, how long does it take them to do a task with this version versus this other version? Kind of simple version of that. So when we talk about experimental design specifically, so where we're controlling things and we're comparing conditions, right? Comparing different versions or different options. We usually design those in one of two ways. So we have what's called a between subjects design. So the word subjects is synonymous with participant or user. It's just kind of historical that we use the word subjects. We don't use that so much anymore, but we do use it here. So between subjects or between people, in that kind of design, each person who evaluates your interface or your product is only going to evaluate a single version of it. So if we had our app where we had one with the red background and one with the green background, a person would come in and they would either get the red one or the green one, and they would evaluate it. And it would be random, which one they were assigned to. And they would never see the other one. Another person might see the other one. On the other hand, we can do what we would call a within subjects study. And that would mean that every person that comes to evaluate our interface would see the red version and the green version. And in that case, they would experience both of those interfaces and evaluate both of them. Now, we would kind of randomize what order we show them to people in, because that does have an effect. If everybody sees green first, it may just be that everybody likes the first thing they see, and so we may not really be able to figure out what the effect of the color is. But these are the two forms of experimental design. You can mix these together if you do something a little more complicated, but just at a basic level, these are kind of the main ways of doing this. So here it is visualized a little bit. In this case, I've got a red and blue version of this app. So if we're doing a between subjects design, you see that participant number one will just see the blue version, Participant 2 will just see the red version, 3 will see the blue, and so on. Whereas if we do the within subjects, participant 1 will see, the blue version and the red version. Participant 2 will see the red version and the blue version. Everyone will see every version. Now there are some benefits and drawbacks to these designs. So in general, when you do a between subjects design where each person only sees one condition, you're going to need a lot more people to take part in your study to be able to find an effect if there is a difference between them. On the other hand, if you find an effect in a between subjects design, you can be pretty sure that it's a legitimate effect. It is a result of the thing you're testing. In a within subjects design, you can use less participants because essentially what people are doing is because they see both versions, they're making a comparison. And so it's easier from a statistical standpoint to find these differences in evaluation of the versions. Now, you do risk something there. It depends on what you're evaluating, but if you think about it, people, for one thing, they learn. So, they might come in and use the blue interface and then the red interface, but when they first use the blue interface, they haven't ever used the interface at all. Now when they use the red one, they've already practiced on the blue one. And so in the simple example, that doesn't seem like it matters too much, especially if we flip the order of them, right? Every person gets, a different chance at getting the red or blue one first. We can kind of mitigate that. As the designs get more complicated and you want to study more things, this is not as easy to do. So there are a lot of things at play. If you remember when we talked about cognition, right, and like giving a person a list of words to remember, how they're more likely to remember the first words and the last words in that list later. This is similar. We see some effects like this: ordering effects, learning effects, practice effects, and these are all things you can mitigate in a study. But that can be complicated, and that can be the source of error. So these are two really the most popular approaches for any kind of science that's looking at comparing things. But you do have to choose carefully. So once we've kind of chosen what we're doing, whether that be a simple evaluation test or usability test, or a more controlled study where we're doing either between participants or within participants designs, we need to decide what we're going to measure. And so you're probably familiar with this from some course you've taken in your life, but the idea of independent and dependent variables. Okay? So in general, independent variable is something that we as the researcher or the designer or the evaluator, we control that. So the red or the blue, right? We control if the interface is red or blue. Another independent variable that you might not think of is kind of anything to do with the participant and their characteristics. So it might be, how old are they? What's the first language they learned to speak? Where have they lived, most of their life? How often do they use a tablet or a touch screen? Do they have pets? There are a lot of things that characterize people, right? And so if you've ever, taken part in a study, the first part or last part of the study is usually asking you some demographic information about yourself. And those are the characteristics that the participants bring with them. Now, we can't control those or manipulate those unless we recruit specific people. But they're independent things. And we should take them into account in some cases. Now, on the other hand, the dependent variables are the thing that we're measuring. So in a lot of cases, this is like, how long did it take the user to click that button? Or, what did they say about their user experience? Did they feel good? Did they feel bad? That kind of thing. We don't have control over that. We want our independent variables plus the evaluation of the system to yield the dependent variable. So when we think about the data that we're going to collect as we do these evaluations, we'll have our independent and dependent variables. So independent, you'll have some control over some of it, especially if you're comparing things, and the participant will bring in some of their own attributes. And then the dependent variables are the things that you've chosen you're going to measure. And so these can be things like performance on a task, how much time does it take? You can do things like, behavioral things like counts, like how many times did they make a mistake while they tried to do this? You can also, especially when you look at user experience overall, you can start to get opinions from users. How did they feel about this? What was that user experience like? And then, as I mentioned, demographics. You always tend to collect that so that you know about the users. So let's talk a little bit about some types of data and then some types of measures. So we're going to talk about two major data types. Again, you've probably heard of this distinction, qualitative versus quantitative. And then we're going to talk about three major measure types. We're going to talk about self-report, behavioral measures, and physiological measures. So in terms of data types, when we think of a quantitative piece of data, that's usually something that we directly measure, whether it's the timing of something, a count of something. You might physically measure something in some cases, but it's usually numeric or easily converted into something that is it can be put on a numeric scale and compared and computed and used in a statistical analysis. And quantitative data is usually constrained in some form. So, if I give you a choice of, how much do you like this, whatever, and I give you, 1, I don't like it at all, 5, I really like it, and I only let you choose 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, well, you can't pick, 3.21 necessarily. So there's some constraint there, just in the sense of how you measure. And it's kind of, you're pushing or molding this data into something that's quantitative and can be computed. Now, qualitative data, on the other hand, is usually collected through either just observing, whether that's recording video or sitting and watching and taking notes, or through talking to someone, interviewing them, asking them questions. And the collection of the data doesn't really constrain it in the same way that quantitative collection does. So it's usually not numeric data. It's usually based in language, so people talking about something. But usually with qualitative data, you will take that data and you will analyze it, you will code it or cluster it or categorize it to get meaning out of it. And so both types of data are valuable and are useful in doing evaluations. Now, the different types of measures that we need to think about. So there's 3 types of measures. The first one is a self-report, and that's when we ask somebody to just, tell us, did you like that? Or, how difficult was that? Or how strongly do you agree that whatever? It gives you the person's perceptions. Okay? It may not be what's really happening in the world. It may not be true necessarily, but it is what they perceive. It's also subject to biases. So, humans we're very social. We talked about a lot of our unconscious biases. Those are all at play when you do a self-report. So you've got to really think about that when you start to ask people questions, because tend to give you what they think the right answer is, maybe the answer they think you'll like. There can be a lot of things at play there. But self-report measures are very common. They're easy to administer. You can give a survey, you can do an interview, and they're useful, especially when we start to think about user experience and what people think of something. Self-report is a really important part of that. On the other hand, we have behavioral measures, which are usually things that we measure just through observing a user's behavior or a participant's behavior. And so we usually, those are less obtrusive to participants. So if you think about it, if you go and ask someone, to tell you about something, they're aware you're asking them. And that changes things a little bit. Behavioral measures can usually be obtained or recorded without the user or participant really having to think about it too much or realize it too much. And they're often more quantitative in nature. They can be easier to analyze in the sense of that they're well defined, and they usually they capture what actually happened. Right? They're not based on the perception of the user. Now, they're still subject to biases in the way you measure. If you were to set up a flawed way of measuring, that would be a problem. And they don't always capture the user experience fully. So they might give you some insight. You might see like, oh, well, when this user talks to this robot, most people for some reason are like leaning to the left. And you might not know why. The behavioral measure will show you the behavior that's happening. But you may have to, to follow up with some self-report and to maybe get clued in on what exactly is going on there. So these measures work together. The third type of measure is a physiological measure. And these are things like a person's heart rate, their respiration rate, their skin conductance, physiological responses of a human body. And those can be really useful, mostly because they're fairly objective in that they're hard for a user to control. And they give you a pretty good indicator. So in terms of self-report, I just want to show you a few examples of self-report measures. And we'll start with just questionnaires, right? So here's a simple questionnaire example here. Just asking you, how strongly you agree or disagree with a choice, with a scale there. So you can have simple questions, like a forced choice question where you can have somebody like say yes, no, agree, disagree. You can have a scale response, which is usually called a Likert scale. You'll hear it pronounced Likert sometimes. It's actually Likert. So you'll see that's a scale, kind of like what's shown here. 1 through 5, and you've got some anchors on each side, so 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree. Or you can even have open-ended responses. How did you feel about using this robot? Or what was the best part of the software? That kind of thing. So here's a couple more examples. Kind of pull in on one of these a little bit closer. So this is just one that I pulled that we used in our lab for a study. And so like these are some open-ended questions when we were doing a study with people about using a therapy robot. So some things that we were interested in, is the person we're talking to, have they ever, received care for a traumatic event? Have they ever used either like a therapy animal or a therapy object? So all kind of important. Then you see we kind of move on into some of these scaled responses. So how familiar are you with the idea of using, whatever? And we ask some of those kinds of questions. Here's another example of this is about a robot in a study, and it's asking you to kind of put, a mark where the robot fell on these different scales. And so they've got these different attributes here where they're opposites, right? Trying to get a measure of kind of the user experience or the perception of the robot in this case. So here's some of the robots that we use with children, and when we do studies with children, they're not usually really great at answering surveys in the way that adults are in terms of looking at a scale and marking something. So we usually do convert that over to questions where they have a conversation with someone, and that makes it more of a qualitative self-report. But it allows us to get the data from children or people who are younger, and eliminate any confusion they might have during the measurement process itself. So these are just some of the questions from one of the studies that we would do. So another thing you can do is just straightforward interviews, and those might be very unstructured, or they might be highly scripted, or you can kind of have a mix in between. So when we did kind of our focus group kind of studies on Therabot, we do a semi-structured interview. This is an example of the guide for the person who's conducting the interview, who's talking to a participant. And these are questions they want to touch on, but as they talk to the person, they're going to follow up with things they say that aren't on this script, right? So, and here's just an example of kind of some of the things that might get produced from just pure qualitative analysis. So we've all seen word clouds. That's not the greatest way of analyzing that, but it can be quite interesting and quite telling at times. So I'll move to behavioral measures. So we've talked about kind of the self-report measures, some examples of that. We can also just observe what a participant does, and use that to learn about their use of a system. So we may record that using sensors, or we may manually record that. We may even have the person keep a diary of events as they're using a system, and then we'll analyze that behavioral data later. So this is pretty common when you're doing a usability study. So here's an example that's like, just quantitatively measuring how successful they are at completing a task on an interface. You can also look at levels of success, or you can you can look at, like this graphic is showing 2 different designs and different categories of features that are being used, and measuring the number of usability issues that occurred. And we'll talk about visualization and analysis in the next 2 lectures. This is one that's measuring the time on a task, another common thing that you might measure. Error rates, also common. How many mistakes does somebody make while they're using an interface? You might do something a little more interesting. You might look at engagement patterns. So in this case, this is a kind of a grid overlaid on the interface. And what's happened here is they've used eye tracking while the person is looking at the interface or interacting with it, to kind of see where their visual attention is going. This is a really common technique. So also, as you can see here, like if you're using a mouse, or if you're even touch input, you might have your software log all of those trajectories. You might have the mouse actually that can log the force that's being applied to it, so that you can see how that overlays with the interface that's being used. Okay. So another example I'll show you. This is an example from some work I did when I was an undergrad with the Survivor Buddy robot. And this is looking at kind kind of a field study where we looked at behavioral data. So in this case, we have at the university I was at Texas A&M, they have a large facility. It's called Disaster City, where we have a lot of simulated disaster scenarios like building collapses, train derailments, fires, all kinds of things. And it's a facility that's used to train a lot of people that respond to these events. But we also use it to test robots that would be used in these kinds of events. So this is a study that we did out in that environment, using this Survivor Buddy robot that you see on the right, mounted on top of a SUGV robot, which is it's just a tracked robot, a military robot, and so we you kind of stage this scenario where you're going to have someone who's trapped in this pile of debris. So here you can see these are just excerpts from an article we published on it, and you can see kind of the diagram. So this person is, they're not an actual trapped victim, can't do that. So they're playing the role of one in the confined environment. And you can see in the figure the robot kind of in the foreground there, and that they're interacting with in this study. And so during this, we were using the robot, having the first responders who would respond to an actual event like this actually use the robot, use the control system that we had developed, the interfaces we had developed to communicate with this person who was trapped, and to go through the whole procedure that they would usually go through when they're trying to locate somebody in this scenario and communicate with them and help them. And the purpose of this being to see, how is the robot, changing how they would do this, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, how do they try to use it, that kind of thing. And so in this case, kind of the outcome of that study is an analysis of their behaviors. And so this is a figure from that publication about that, just showing two participants, two of these sessions, and where we've kind of mapped out on a timeline, what was going on with the robot, what was going on with the human, and analyzing that. And so during this, we would have different systems that would fail or things that would happen, but you kind of are taking in a ton of this qualitative behavioral data, right? So we're recording everything, lots of video streams, you're recording all of the interactions with the system, and then you take that back and you're going to go through it and try to lay it out and make sense of what happened. And you're asking, the person who was on the other side of the robot, how did they feel when the robot was talking to them? What kind of things did they experience? You're looking at both sides of it. So it's, it's kind of it can become a complex operation. And this is a relatively simple study. This is not. This is more of a set of case studies because it is difficult to get these experts to come and do this, and it takes several hours for each of these. So you can't run 100 people through this. So the data here really is rich qualitative data that you have to take from and use that to learn. So that was an example kind of behavior monitoring and using that to analyze a system. So the third area that we talked about is the physiological monitoring. And so here I've got a kind of just a diagram showing you different things that are commonly measured. Most common is going to be heart rate and respiration, usually skin conductance. So there's a skin response for a lot of things. And this data will be collected and synced with the study or the interaction that you're running, so that you can see physiological changes as they occur during the interaction. So those are some of the measurement approaches that we have. Now thinking more about the actual tools and measures that we use. So for self-reports, there are usually for every field of study, kind of every area that you investigate, there are what are considered validated or commonly used questionnaires for specific things. And those are preferable because they've been used in other evaluations, and in some sense they've been validated for reliability, and that becomes important, especially if you're kind of in the academic world or you're publishing things. You don't want to just make up questions, because when you do that, you have to validate that you've designed a question that measures the thing you want to measure, and you've got to think about the confounds and the biases, and so you usually have to go through a validation period when you create new ways of measuring. So an example of a really commonly used one, and I'll show it on the next slide, I think, is the system usability scale, and this is for just kind of software interfaces traditionally. It's a self-report measure, and it just has a bunch of items that are very common for across interfaces. When we talk about like behavior observation, we've spoken a lot about timing different operations, or counting things, or doing the heat maps, that kind of thing. And with that, sometimes you need a little extra hardware. Like if you want to track where someone is looking with their eyes, you need the right camera system to do that. Sometimes you might want certain sensors to sense when someone moves from one area to another area or does something like that. And then when you do physiological measurement, obviously you need specialized equipment. I've got an example of one of the systems that we use. There are a lot of systems out there, and even today now, a lot of the fitness bands or smartwatches are to a point where we can actually make use of some of that data, which is really nice, because these other systems, to get the higher fidelity data, they do require attaching electrodes and kind of going through a process and making sure all of that is configured correctly, which takes time, and then takes time to analyze later. But you'll have specialized equipment depending on kind of what you're measuring. So the system usability scale, which is a really common one, so it's got 10 items on it, and it's usually done with a 1 through 5 scale of strongly agree, strongly disagree. And these are kind of just some really basic statements that someone can respond to after they've used any system, really. So you can see, we're looking at things like, I would use this to solve my problem. I think it would be helpful. It was easy to use. It was unnecessarily complex. So that's another thing you'll see. I should mention that survey design is its whole own art form, or science if you like. When we design these surveys, and this is why you want to use validated questionnaires if you can, you'll see the same thing asked in opposite ways. And a lot of times that's to make sure that we have some internal validity. So, we'll ask if you thought it was unnecessarily complex, and also if you thought it was, easy to use or too simple, the opposites. And you'll use that kind of as a validation step when you are analyzing your data. Sometimes you have, instances where people either weren't really paying attention, depending on the participants you're recruiting, or what's going on. It also might just indicate a problem in how you're administering the survey, or you might have something distracting going on in the environment. So there's a lot of internal validity mechanisms built into these And when we get to like the point on our projects where we actually are going beyond just peer evaluation, where we're talking to each other about it, where we get to that step where we want to send our interface to a few people we know and get them to use it and tell us what they think. We'll talk about some more of these surveys, and we'll talk about like how should you do this? What's the easiest way? If we'll probably be doing most of ours like remotely online, so how to use different free software like Google Forms or SurveyMonkey or whatever, and to be able to gather that data and then analyze that data. So some common behavioral measures. I think I've mentioned a number of these already, but time to finish a task, number of errors while completing a task, how many input events, how many clicks does it take, how many times does the user look for help or ask for help, or how many times do they use a specific feature that you've provided. Here's an example of a heat map JavaScript library that's kind of just to give you an idea how easy this is now. And this is used to evaluate any kind of web app or website. It uses just a built-in webcam to track the person's eyes to see. Well, actually, this one may use the mouse as well. Some of them, the early ones, just use the mouse. Now we are able to do it with webcams, just to track what people are looking at. So I'll show you a video of this is called WebGazer.
We present WebGazer.js, an online eye-tracking library that infers the eye gaze locations of visitors on a web page in real time. WebGazer.js uses common webcams that are already present in laptops and mobile devices without the need of purchase of additional equipment. Unlike commercial eye trackers, WebGazer.js does not require explicit calibration. Instead, it continuously self-calibrates by incorporating user interactions such as clicks and cursor movements that normally occur in all websites. WebGazer.js uses a regression model to map eye features to screen locations. For every video frame, the pixels that correspond to the user's eyes are detected. Every time a user interaction occurs, WebGazer.js trains its regression model by matching its location on the screen to the corresponding eye pixels. In the absence of any user interactions, the regression model continuously infers the eye gaze locations on the screen in real time. WebGazer.js is developed in pure JavaScript, is open source, and is supported by almost all web browsers. Developers can swap between face and eye detection libraries and different regression models. WebGazer.js can be incorporated in any web page with only a few lines of code and can perform eye tracking immediately with an average error of 100 pixels. WebGazer.js makes eye tracking possible for millions of users and many applications. For example, online newspapers can see what articles the readers are interested in. Search engines can see what results are most relevant to their users. And eye movements can be integrated in online gaming.
So it's a pretty cool example, and kind of nice to see how far we've come, that it's that easy to integrate something like that into your software. So we've talked about kind of the tools for measuring, the different ways of measuring, different ways of setting up the study. We also need to identify who will evaluate our system. Usually that's whoever you're targeting to use your system. But you do want to kind of be careful. If you're getting to that more formal evaluation, you want an unbiased viewpoint. Usually your friends and family are too nice, and they may not, or in some cases the opposite. They will maybe not give you a neutral perspective on the system, right? You also kind of have to think about, your resources. How much time do you have? In a lot of cases, when you have people participate in these studies, you want to give them something, in appreciation for their time. You want to give them some kind of payment, some kind of gift. So that can factor into this. And you also have to think about ethical concerns, right? So especially when we start to look at populations that are protected in different ways, so children, so people under the age of 18 in the United States, people who are incarcerated are protected populations, anybody who has an impairment or a disability, and people who are in a power structure where the power dynamics are different. So if you are a teacher, you probably should not recruit your students to participate in your study. That's typically not something you do, because you there's the potential that you have influence over them that could cause some problems. Similar with employers and their employees, that can be problematic, and that gets back to kind of the ethical side of things, and being certain that you're thinking about that, protecting the people that are going to evaluate your system. So once we've gotten through all of that, what's really important is to create a protocol. So you've got to have detailed steps that you're going to take to do your evaluation, because you want the evaluation to be the same every time, and you want, if you're running, as you start to run bigger studies or evaluations, it spans beyond one person usually, or one team, and you've got different groups of people conducting these evaluations, and you want to be sure they all do it the same way, right? So you need to really document everything very well. Certainly for experiments, for controlled studies, you need to document it to the point that another research group or lab could replicate your study. That's important. And you certainly need that documentation to get your ethical approval. So in the United States, we have the Institutional Review Board for all of our studies that we do with people. And we're required to go through that process whenever we decide to conduct a study. That can be quite intense, or it can be easy. It depends. The whole point of it is to protect everyone involved. As a researcher, if you're conducting a study, you do have to complete a training course and kind of learn all of these basic things about how you protect participants and data and all of the things that you should be doing. Also, in the United States, the Institutional Review Board is always kind of doing the oversight role of your study. So you do have to report to them on a regular basis. If anything goes wrong in your study, you have to report that immediately. I can tell you, since we do a lot of work with children, if a child starts crying in a study, you've got to shut it down, and you can't do any more work on that study until you go through a full review process and try to find out what exactly happened, what upset them, what are you going to change to make sure this doesn't happen in the future. It's about preventing harm, but it can be very very involved, just managing this part of it, but it's very important. You've got to consider a lot of things about data and privacy today. That's really important, and it is a huge part of it, especially when you're working with the technology side of things. So if you've got imaging sensors and you're collecting video and audio and that kind of thing, you need to specify how that's going to be kept secure and private. So once you've got all of that, you start conducting your evaluation, and then you'll get your results and start to analyze those. And that's what we'll talk about on Tuesday, is starting to analyze results. So the impact of this overall process is meant to inform the design of a product or a system. It helps designers, and it can find problems, and it can identify new areas of interest. I wanted to share some of the results from some of the studies that I mentioned earlier. So in our Therabot design study that I've talked about, we asked this question about, just asking people how harmful they thought, or how harmful or beneficial they thought, this robot would be, depending on the age of the user. And you can see an interesting effect where most of the people thought it would be more useful for children, ages 0 to 11 there. And then you see kind of a dip for adults, and then it kind of picks back up for the older adults. Here's some kind of the data from some of the bullying studies that we've done. This is showing the difference between the human and robot interviewers, and whether the participants talked about socially protective factors when they were interviewed. And so this is a finding that kids are more comfortable with the robot. They have a lot more trust for the robot. And this is an example of some qualitative results, right? These are quotes from, in this case, children in the study. You can see they're expressing that they would tell things to this robot that they wouldn't tell to other people. They felt more comfortable with it, like it wouldn't judge them like a person would. Kind of some concerning findings. And that was the point of part of our study in this case, was to look at these ethical questions about kids and technology, and kind of what do they perceive in terms of privacy and protection. And there have been some interesting cases of kids' toys, some of the smart toys that record data from children, and just some horrible things happening there with data breaches and all these recordings being exposed, and then also aspects of a child's privacy, because some of these toys would record what the child would say and let the parents hear that conversation without the knowledge of the child. You can get some great ethical questions out of this kind of thing. And so that's part of kind of some of the stuff that we look at. Here's some findings from some of those police SWAT team studies about different controllers that we used, comparing them, just kind of the findings there, and some of the lessons that were gathered from that. So these are on the slides if you're interested. So just summing it all up, you want to define the thing you want to evaluate, and then carefully craft your evaluation methods, and make your protocol, and then you run your study. And you always want to have a plan about how you're going to analyze that data before you conduct your study. And we'll talk about that next time in detail, a kind of data analysis, and how do you get meaning out of these measurements. So action item wise, quiz 5 is due tonight by midnight. I apologize, yesterday I meant to post it in the morning and I didn't, so I just made it due at midnight. So if you haven't done it, please do it. It is a pretty easy quiz to complete. Your reflection 6 will be due on Monday by midnight, and then you can see the other things that we've got on the calendar. But we'll meet next time Tuesday for talking about analyzing evaluation data. We will meet on WebEx, and we'll also talk about when I'll start hosting class in person. We'll still have virtual class, but it is looking like we'll be able to do that. It won't be next week, but the week after that is likely when we will be able to transition to that. If if you don't, want to show up, it's just like I'm filming it from a different location, so there's no worries about that. But we'll talk about it for anybody who is interested in coming to be in the classroom. That will be not next week, but the following week. So that's everything I have. Next time we'll talk about analyzing evaluation data. Oh, okay, there's a question. Should our prototype be fully functional for evaluation? Yeah, and we can talk more about what fully functional means, but yeah, it needs to be able to do the things for the problem it's going to solve for the ultimate evaluation that we do. Now, for the peer review that we're about to do a week from today, no, it doesn't have to be fully functional. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks everybody. Have a great weekend, and I will see you guys on Tuesday, and I'll hang out here to answer questions if you have them. Let's see. Yes, just keep working on the prototype for the review next week. Does it have to actually work, or can we make it look like it does? Just make it look like, do your best to make it look like it works, or make it actually work, whatever you can do. We'll talk more about making it actually work next week, so don't worry too much if it doesn't actually work yet. Just do your best, and we'll work to make them better. Do we need to design a consent for our survey? No, you won't have to, and we'll talk about that later too. You are exempt from that.